I'm very glad to introduce to you the Clements Center's own new Associate Director, Dr. Angelica Martinez.
Good morning, and welcome to the Commanding Beyond Combat, Military Leadership and the Struggle for Global Influence panel. It is indeed a pleasure and a privilege to welcome three distinguished senior military leaders whose commitment to service endures well beyond their time in uniform, which for these generals spans 4 decades plus each. It's a pleasure to introduce General Vince Brooks, former commander of United Nations, Combined Forces Command, United States Forces Korea, who is also a distinguished National Security Fellow at the Clements Center and the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. In the middle, I'd like to introduce General Peter Chiarelli, United States Army, retired as the 32nd Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, and currently serves as the president of the Robert F. Gates Global Policy Center. Sitting next to me is General Todd Wolters, United States Air Force, who retired as the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander of Europe and Commander, U.S. European Command. Generals, welcome, and thank you for joining the Texas National Security Forum. We're very much looking forward to your insights. Today, I thought I would begin with yet another reading. We're assigning the audience a few readings. And if you haven't had a chance to read the Wall Street Journal article that Secretary Gates wrote, it's called "The U.S. Can Rise to Meet the China Challenge." And to open the panel, as opposed to backing into an assessment of the threat and security challenges, I thought we would dive right in. So, generals, Secretary Gates issued a call to action in this article and in his words. And in doing so, he underscores the very multidimensional nature of the threat, perhaps different than you faced when you were in uniform. And so how do each of you assess this challenge and also the opportunities ahead of us? General Brooks, maybe start with you, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Martinez. She's Dr. Martinez, also Colonel Martinez. She has a PhD, but really it's the MBA that counts. That's made by Army. Okay, but delight to be with everyone today, and especially with Todd Wolters and Pete Chiarelli, two generals I have great admiration for. I think there are lots of opportunities that are out there in terms of rising to meet the challenge of China. And I'll just start by saying it has to begin with understanding China a bit better and seeing the world from, at least as closely as we can, from a different perspective than our own traditional way of viewing things. And so, for example, if we are thinking about competition economically around the world, how do you dissuade a China that believes that that's actually containment? And so there is a communication effort, there's an engagement effort that has to be a part of any approach to China. I'm of the opinion a broader set of engagements, not just at the highest levels of government, which is how we have historically done it, very, very restrictive in our engagements and encounters with the People's Republic of China. But to have more engagement creates a different point of understanding and a different point of departure then about sensing where opportunities may be, where responses may come differently. So I'm of the view that we ought to be trying to find as many ways as possible to engage. At the same time, recognizing that it is a competition. Competition and conflict are not the same, but to be sure. Competition can include cooperation in many ways, but it can also include displacing influence, displacing markets, taking opportunities away, constraining outcomes, and we ought to be engaged actively in that. So I think we have the opportunity to sense what is required strategically to operate in a world where China is not going to disappear. It's going to continue to grow. What is required for the United States? Where do we see ourselves, and where does China see itself?
Thank you, General Brooks. General Chiarelli?
Well, I've been working with Secretary Gates for quite a while on this issue of non-kinetic instruments of power. And I believe he's really on to something. And in his article, he points out, and I don't think we should forget, and as a young officer who grew up in Germany, taking my 72-ton tank out of a caserne in Gelnhausen and rushing up to the border when somebody said Lariat advance. Mm-hmm. I never thought that enemy on the other side, at least who I thought was my enemy, would come down without a shot being fired. But the fact of the matter is, it did. And there should be some great lessons in that to us, that the non-kinetic instruments of power are really important. That, in fact, is what caused the Soviet Union to crumble. And as I look at how we are today taking those down to the maybe bare foundation, in some instances, not even the foundation, we've totally wrecked them. I think it's a time that we need to really think about how we rebuild them. It does not mean they did not need some kind of change. They did. But I think it's important for us to look now, as we face China, at how we rebuild some of those elements that I think are so critical to our national strategy.
Thank you. General Wolters.
Well, Dr. Colonel, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to be here. And it's great to see General Brooks and General Chiarelli, two great leaders that have done a lot for our country. Despite the fact that they're both in the United States Army, I still love them. I'm an Air Force guy. I'm aligned very much with what both generals said, and I'll just take a slightly different stance, one I know that Secretary Gates is fond of. I contend that in the 21st century, what's changed just a little bit, and again, the globe always changes, is the fact that a human that exists on planet Earth has a bubble and a degree of access to communication more so than we have in the past. And this world is dangerous. It's always been dangerous. I think it's probably a little bit more inflammatory, and the likelihood of transitioning out of competition, as Vince Brooks talked about, into conflict is more likely than it probably has ever been in the past. And for a nation to effectively deter and dissuade and promote generating greater peace across planet Earth is a goal that all democracies should aspire to achieve, and I believe it's one that we attempt to achieve as the United States of America, except it's incredibly expensive, and it requires some shifts in thinking. And I will just quickly parlance into military terms. This thing called national posture is something that has a great degree of influence across the globe, and when an inspirational democracy like the United States of America changes its national posture, that there is an ability to influence greater peace on planet Earth. And as a European commander with very little time in the Pacific, I sense that this is something that could be a global norm. And I think as Secretary Gates alluded to in some of his articles, this thing called posture from a security perspective, it involves where your forces are militarily and how quickly they can respond from a global perspective to generate greater peace. And I contend that democracies today bear the responsibility to improve their posture to generate greater peace. Hence, you get into discussions about how quick, how agile, and how influential a nation's military can be to be able to go to hotspots across the globe and make sure that we can keep ourselves away from boiling crises that quickly tip into conflict, and find ways to take those boiling crises and get them to the left just a little bit, where Vince talked about in the area of competition. And I contend that the United States of America has been and remains the greatest nation on planet Earth to be able to influence getting hotspots out of crisis and back into competition. And it's something that is done with a posture that probably includes firepower that can project long distances with great accuracy, and a willingness to traverse the entire globe. And that's not cheap. It's hard to convince your citizens that that's something that you need to do. And it just happens to be a spot where the United States of America is in right now. And it's a transformation that is taking place, and we'll see how it pans out in the future.
Thank you, General Wolters. And on that point, I'd like it if we could consider the implications for the defense technology sector, the defense industrial base, and how we can compete in denied integrated environments in your experience, and how do we de-risk? General Brooks, if you could start us off, please.
Yeah, I want to separate the defense technology structure from the defense industrial base. And just for the logic of one tends to be an established structure that provides depth, and the other one is the platform for innovation, and at least in my way of thinking, and certainly we could debate that. The defense technology sector, it has to be largely in the public domain. Commercial enterprises, startups, established businesses who have already figured lots of things out, because the rate of change is too fast for the congressional budgeting process. And so having then access to that and viewing it as a part of our national power, to me, is very important. So technology and innovation as an instrument of national power would be the way I think about it. Let me transition to the defense industrial base. That, as I said, is a more established structure that gives us depth, gives us the ability to last through an extended campaign, or to expand capability from where it exists to where it needs to be in a time of crisis, and then can shrink again. And that's a fallow field right now. The amount of atrophy that's happened in the defense industrial base gives us very little depth. And it tends to lead to policy thinking that requires a short war or short engagements, short, sharp engagements that can be brought to a close quickly. And we lose the ability then to recognize that, it sometimes takes generations to really make a lasting change. So there is a need to deeply review the defense industrial base, and not necessarily grow it back to World War II, 1945 size, but you have to get it out of 1936 size, which is where we are right now. And so is our military. We are sized about the same way as the United States military forces were during an established time of an isolationist policy. And so how do you get from that to be able to respond militarily, globally, as General Wolters talked about, and then sustain in potentially multiple places concurrently and for extended periods of time? That sounds like long war to me, but it comes from your defense industrial base. We look at Russia right now as they continue operations in Ukraine. And while they have been terrible stewards of the human capital and the materiel that they've committed to that fight, they're just grinding it up, people and things. They've got an incredible magazine depth, and we're nowhere close to that. And that's the waning Russian Empire, to use the reference to what Secretary Gates was talking about. That is nothing like the depth that China has. And so to be able to stand toe-to-toe on a global basis, sustain losses, regenerate power, and continue to use it in places that create disadvantage for our adversaries, wherever that might happen to be on a global scale, you need depth, and we don't have it right now.
Thank you. General Chiarelli?
Yeah, I just add to that. And when you're trying to regain that depth, there are bill payers. And one of the areas that I am really worried about, if we were getting into any kind of prolonged fight, is our ability to take care of those who fight for us, our medical capability. It has atrophied in the last 10 years to a point that we have some real issues. For any of you who get scheduled for an MRI, you know how long it takes to get in to get that MRI. Well, if you look at our ability to provide medical services in an area like the Indo-Pacific, where you've got real issues with time and space, there is no more golden hour. Leaders are talking in terms of the golden 3 or 4 days. And I worry also about our ability to take care of those where we have much higher casualty rates than we would in other kinds of fights back here in the United States. Again, if you are trying to get surgery right now, there's a real reliance on civilian hospitals to take care of those who are or would be wounded in any kind of conflict. So I worry about those, not only the things that Vince talked about, I worry about some of the supporting elements that are absolutely critical, paying the price for the fact we're trying to rebuild some of those areas that we're lacking in.
Thank you. General Wolters.
Well, I'm very aligned with General Chiarelli's points and General Brooks' points, and I'd just like to piggyback on both of them and maybe extend the discussion in the strategic paradigm just a little bit. I think as a nation, the United States once again bears the responsibility of leading from the front to show other nations and other continents and other alliances. This is how you take the technological community, connect the dots to the industrial base, and then superimpose the security apparatus that represents a democratic nation on top of it, and find a way to adapt this three-headed monster to make gains in what you can do in generating greater peace. I think that is the strategic definition of the problem, and as General Brooks pointed out, where we really suffer is adapting this three-headed monster to ever get to a point to where you can ever field something in time to where it can make a difference to secure greater peace in the environment, in the battle space, again, to dissuade and deter and to keep what is boiling in a crisis and get it back to competition. I marvel again, and our previous speakers did a great job of this. I too am an optimist with bureaucracies. Somehow, some way, the American people wind up proving to me over and over again how smart they are. And you see some small gains as I take a very, very microscopic look at Russia-Ukraine. Just recently, the ceaseless deficit that NATO and Europe and the U.S. were in with respect to ammunition in 2023, if you paid close attention, that's actually been flipped on its side, and we've reversed it. And now the democracies that represent the goodness in that confrontation, we're back on the step from an ammunition perspective. And this goes to exactly what General Brooks was talking about. This technological community quickly recognized what the problem was, and we had an industrial base that was trying to work it, and then we had a demand signal from democratic nations to try to get to it, and quite honestly, nations were paralyzed with what they needed to do to actually get more ammo and obligate those funds. And over time, we've been able to work it. It took 2.5 years, and I think all of us would agree here on stage 2.5 years might be a little bit too long, but it's been accomplished. And it leaves us something to look at to be able to improve upon in the future. And I think that's just, it's going to take more elbow grease, it's going to take more time, it's going to take more learning, it's going to take more listening, but it's achievable, and it's a path that we should take, and I think we will take as a nation, and certainly as an alliance that can cook to try to create some remedies in Europe, and obviously look to do some of the same in the Asia-Pacific region.
Thank you, General Wolters. I think we'd be remiss if we don't talk about the importance of allies and partners on this panel. And so I'd like to ask about your experience with allies and partners, and how does this create more strategic depth? How does this enable the United States to confront not only this challenge, but other challenges that we've heard about this morning? General Brooks, if you'd like to start us off.
Okay. Well, we
Glad
can just,
I don't have your seat.
yeah, exactly. We have to trade seats here. This military sequencing, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how we count. Don't go any higher than that, though. On the same topic we were just talking about, ammunition in many ways was that part of the defense industrial base became a collective defense industrial base where the capacity was broader than just what the United States could bring to bear by way of things like standing NATO agreements. General Wolters got to officiate over a command that has multiple nations in it, and they have standing agreements on things like the caliber of ammunition, how many grains of explosive are inside of a particular shell, so that they can interchange the use of munitions, just as an example. not to mention things like technological interoperability so that radios can talk to each other, so that logistics can be operated the same way, so that the fuel can be moved from an American to a Brit or to a Pole. That's not the case throughout the world, though. So that was the premier structure, the NATO structure. But we use that same structure with countries who are like-minded, who might be committed elsewhere in the world to some problem that is emerging, trying to drive it back to competition if we can, but in that short flare-up period or in a prolonged war, others will be there because of the relationships that have been established. Now, here's where I will reveal myself as an unabashed globalist. Those don't happen overnight. You don't just go out and ask for allies. You build alliances, you build relationships that provide things like access, basing, overflight, the use of spectrum, which is critically important to the modern military and the future military. Spectrum. All these things become a function of relationships that have been built by continuous contact and engagement and presence. Now, they don't have to go to the scale of a NATO to a full alliance, or the Korea-U.S. Republic of Korea alliance, which is another standing alliance. It can be more ad hoc, but there has to be something that brings them together. Like-minded orientation, relationship, then you get into the other things that are technical and procedural. So I am all about the U.S. military being part of our instrumentality for operating in the world. We are the only nation that is continuously global. We have commands that are established that give us the ability to cover the entirety of the globe. Even when we adjust them, we're still maintaining a footprint that lets us do that. Every other country, including our allies, must concentrate in a given area, given the size of their militaries, and not be continuously engaged on a global scale. Well, there's a reason for that. It's so that we can build these relationships around the world. And presence matters for human beings. So being in exercises with them, helping them solve some of their internal problems on their own modernization and design, or even their own cultural issues within their militaries. We find ourselves engaged in all of that. So allies, partners, these are two different entities, friends, people of common interest, all the above. And the U.S. military particularly has to be agile enough to be on the leading edge of all things, technological, military, strategic, but also to be broad enough to be on the trailing edge, which means that if you have capability that's going to be of help to us and we're of like mind and we have a relationship, we have room for you. Even if you don't bring your own logistics system, even if you don't bring your own strike fighters, we have what you have, we need, and we will find a way to bring it. And it's going to generally be the United States that is finding the way to integrate all those things into a rational relationship. And it starts from the interpersonal relationships.
Thanks, General Brooks. General Chiarelli?
Yeah, and as one who commanded a multinational corps in Iraq, I realized the absolute criticality of allies. It freed up U.S. forces in many instances to do things that they would not have been able to do had they not had those other boots on the ground. There's a new kind of ally that I've just been kind of introduced to. I had a really rough time when I was in Iraq on both of my tours in getting the kind of help I needed for, and I'll go back to these non-kinetic elements of power. You know, how do we go into a place like Baghdad that's looking for some kind? They're not looking for 24/7 electricity. They were looking for some kind of regularity in when their electricity was going to be turned on, so they knew when they could cook every single day. They weren't looking for a U.S. model of how electricity was developed. They were looking to get the sewage out of the front yard of their house. Moms wanted that because their kids got sick. I've recently been, and I couldn't get U.S. experts to come in and help me with that problem. I've recently been introduced to what's going on in Ukraine today, and I don't think it's being talked enough about. In particular, there are a lot of folks that are over there helping the Ukrainians from the private sector, and foundations that are over there. My introduction is with Howard G. Buffett, And he's an amazing man who's spent a lot of time in a lot of different countries. But there's been a couple articles written about him recently that points at the fact that he spent over $1 billion of foundation money assisting the Ukrainians in non-military things, but in a way they support the military. Example, demining. He got John Deere involved and some of the big companies here in the United States to come over and create demining equipment for them that could solve some of the problems that they've got because of the use of scatterable munitions. He's provided a lot of support in the area of forensics for the National Police to collect information of war atrocities committed by the Russians in Ukraine. And something that I'm very familiar with, he's built a hospital over there called Superhumans that takes care of Ukrainians, all Ukrainians, both those in the military and civilians who need prosthetics. It is estimated in that war that by the end of this year, there will be 80,000 Ukrainians who need a prosthetic of some kind, representing 150 prosthetics, 150,000 prosthetics, because it's so many double and triple amputees. I've been through just about every single military hospital in the country, looking at our ability to provide those kind of services, but I have never seen anything quite like the facility he built in Lviv called Superhumans to provide that. Not only to those injured on the front lines, but to Ukrainian civilians who are often casualties to some of these scatterable mines and other things in war that create people who need prosthetics. This is a change from my time in Iraq to see U.S. foundations, corporations, and others who are working hard and bring a capability to the battlefield that I think is one we should not overlook.
Thank you. General Wolters.
Well, Pete, that's powerful testimony. I've had the opportunity to see the same site in Lviv, and it is incredibly inspiring. One of the, having served as a NATO commander, as SACEUR, one of the terrible jokes that you hear over and over again, because everything that you do in NATO, by the North Atlantic Council decree, you have to have 100% unanimity in the decision. So today, all 32 nations have to agree on the decision. And if just one nation dissents, then you hold off on progressing with whatever issue it is you're trying to debate from a policy perspective and from an enactment perspective. So from that, the joke is it's the only thing worse than going to war with NATO is going to war without NATO. And it is ever so true, and I think what Vince and Pete talked about are completely spot on. And the piece that became very apparent to me during my time serving as SACEUR was, with allies and partners, there is a mill-to-mill relationship. And for us in the military wearing a uniform, it takes very little time to become ironclad in its ever-loving support in perpetuity. You wind up comfortably looking at a fellow service member from Istanbul saying, "I'd die for you." And he would or she would say, "I'd die for you." And after just a couple of engagements, you believe that you would die for each other. And it exists that way, certainly in NATO for the 32 nations that are involved, and it's powerful. It's mill to mill, and because we know a little bit more today than we used to know back in 1975 or 1935, we believe that there's more to an alliance than just the mill-to-mill aspect. It is often talked about the whole of government alignment with respect to allies and partners. And if you as a military member aren't nurturing the whole of government approach to your allies and partners, you're probably making a mistake. And I can comfortably tell you that in NATO, as a military commander working with President Trump and President Biden, there was a little bit different approach. President Trump believed that being a demanding customer to his allies and partners was the best way to go to get all 32 nations to a threshold that he thought was viable. He was our president, that's what we did. He's now our president, that's what we're doing. In between, President Biden had a different approach. But in both those cases, both of our presidential leaders behind the scenes were very kind in their comments to national leaders with respect to NATO allies and partners' willingness to support. And again, both President Biden and President Trump were keen to point out that there is more than just the mill-to-mill aspect of what takes place in an alliance. And in the 21st century, we have to look at information, we have to look at economies, we have to look at policies, and all of that is involved in allies and partners. And the globe will be a safer place if we can find a way to advance the cause of comprehensive understanding of what allies and partners should do. And just as Vince said, I'll end it with this. It is something that you have to nurture every second of the day, and there is no detail too small. And certainly in the military dimension, if you're not considering the whole of government approach to allies and partners, you're going to be set back more than you should in the 21st century.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for bringing in the role of the private sector. I wondered if we couldn't go back to discuss the non-military implements of power, General Chiarelli, and maybe how senior military leaders could better integrate them. Diplomacy, development, it was brought up on the previous panel. It's a real problem for combatant commanders when there's not an ambassador in the country that you're trying to work in. So just very curious about your thoughts on non-military implements and how military commanders can support.
Well, Austin's a special place to me because when I went over on my left seat, right seat ride into Baghdad in 2004 with Marty Dempsey, he took me around and he said, you know, the biggest job you're going to have to do in your time in Baghdad, and believe me, I was commanding the 1st Cavalry Division, and the last place I thought that they would ever be deployed was in a city of 7.5 million people with 1 traffic light. But that's where we were going. And he told me, you know, they're coming up with a plan in the Green Zone to spend $20 billion. I think the UN had estimated it was going to be a $60 billion bill to rebuild the infrastructure of Iraq. And there was a whole bunch of people furiously working in the Green Zone to come up with a $20 billion worth of projects. If you want to, that's really hard to do in a short period of time. And we saw that with some of the mistakes that were made. Water treatment plants without any way to get the water to the water treatment plant, if you understand what I'm saying, because there was no infrastructure for us, you know, to move water. But when Marty told me that, it went against, again, back to my time in Geldhausen, taking my tank, you know, up the road to say, wow, this isn't going to be what I thought combat was going to be like. And he said, yeah, you better get smart, because the Iraqis want 3 things. They want sewage. The females really want their kids to be safe, and they realize the problem that standing sewage has. They want potable water, the ability to drink water that doesn't make you sick. They want some kind of desire to know when if the electricity is going to be on for 4 hours, is there a SCADA system in place that says this is the 4 hours it's going to be on so you can use it during that time period? And they want jobs in some kind of medical care. That was never in my first 30 years of training. Those are things I had to work on. So I came down to Austin from Killeen, and I asked the mayor if he would spend some time with my leadership talking about those kinds of things. And we came down here and did a seminar for a week where he brought in the city leaders in areas like garbage. You know, I'll never forget the guy who came in on garbage. I thought he was going to say the most important thing is to ensure that people know what day they pick up the trash can. But that's not what he said, and thank God he didn't, because there were no trash cans in Iraq. They just took the garbage to a location and piled it up and waited for somebody to come and take the pile down. That's the way it worked. He said, you got to know your customer. And I realized through that period of spending time down here with him and talking about electricities and sewers and those other kinds of things we could do, that this was going to be not what I thought combat was all about. Now, it had its moments, I promise you. There were some distinct moments of exactly what I thought it was going to be like. But it were these other things that were absolutely critical if I was going to cut down on the amount of insurgency that was in on the country, that I had to be able to have some knowledge and understanding of how to apply. And it was the mayor of Austin who gave me the opportunity to bring my leaders down here and learn some of the things. And I think I brought a lot more of my kids back to Killeen, Texas than I would have if he had not given me that ability to come down here and learn some things that were absolutely critical in that combat environment.
Thank you. General Wolters?
Well, one of the ways in the military that we promote the civ-mil exchanges to increase the military members' awareness of the whole of government approach is typically in the military, we look at our forces and we say, first and foremost, if you're going to advance in this United States military, you need to understand that the civ-mil relationship is the most important aspect of every part of your activity. And I spent my first 30 years flying a single-seat fighter around the world, and I really enjoyed that. And those skills really didn't help me a whole heck of a lot for the last 10 years. And Marty Dempsey was serving as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when I was serving as the director of operations, a position called the J3. And he was keen to always mentor all of his subordinates. And I think a couple times Dempsey looked at me and he said, Wolters, I think you have a chance of surviving tomorrow, so I'm going to give you some coaching. You need to make sure that for the rest of your military career, you and the people that serve with you understand that it is your responsibility in military uniform to educate the civilian leaders on what it is you do. And every time you have those exchanges, it is your responsibility to draw from them what they do and take what they do and bring it back to your forces. And I had heard that before, but it was pretty powerful coming from Marty Dempsey because he's just one of the loveliest human beings on planet Earth. And he crystallized it in one simple sentence, and I know that he's right. I know that he's still right today. And it's something that allows our civ-mil community to become much closer. And as we get to solving strategic problems, we quickly discover that there's a diplomatic side to the problem, there's an economic side to the problem, and in most cases, those challenges outweigh the military challenge to the problem. But if you're not solving all of them simultaneously, you're kind of dealing with a half a deck of cards when you're attempting to achieve a strategic solution. So I think this technique that was taught to me by many other general officers of educating your civilian leadership on what it is you do in the military and allowing them the opportunity to coach you on what they bring to generating greater peace is a practice that's in good play today in our United States government, and it's going to be one of those practices that we need to continue to introduce to all of our allies and partners to achieve greater peace.
Thanks, General Wolters. General Brooks?
Having experienced the same things with them, I certainly hearken back on the importance of recognizing that there are other instruments of power, and indeed that there are limits to what the military can actually accomplish. So the military can create circumstances very quickly that open the door for other instruments to be used, whether it's a demonstration or a show of force, which then changes the outcomes for diplomacy. Very directly, you give an example, the Dayton Accords is a very specific one, but there are many examples of that. Or following on to now the need to create an environment where sewage is off the street. And having seen that same sewage and understudying General Chiarelli as well, that was an important approach. Now, one can debate, is that what the U.S. military is supposed to be doing? Aren't we the ones who are supposed to kill people and break things? I think the words like that have been spoken before. And the answer is yes. But there are certain things that require a follow-through. There's more to it than just being able to kill and to destroy. And we have to make sure that we have generated leaders who are able to think that way, think adaptively. Even if they don't own the capability or don't have expertise in it, to think through what is missing here. A systems approach to sewage and water and electricity, just as an example, systems approach. But we do generate military leaders who can think systematically. We start that down at the lowest levels of our organizations in something we call combined arms. So when do you bring the infantry and the tanks together? Do you need some artillery? What about getting those aircraft in here? The General Wolters is up there flying. When should you sequence it? Who comes first? And under what circumstances? We teach that from the very beginning. So this idea of an integrative mindset is part of the deliberate effort of the U.S. military. As you heard Corey say, that is not the case in every department. And so while we might want to say, well, we do the killing and breaking, and someone else will come along and do everything else, the answer is there's not a someone else. If there's not a secure environment, there's not going to be development that's ongoing at that same time. If there's not development, there's not likely to be stability. If there's not stability, there's not likely to be peace, and you can't go home. So who is going to do it? My first view is it has to be integrated forward on the ground where humans live by military commanders. Now, does that mean you own everything? No, not necessarily. Now, as you go up to higher and higher levels, that may not be as acute as it was certainly in those circumstances in Baghdad, as we were just talking about, where you've now got an alliance. I was the commander in Korea, and as we had a four-way presidential shift, the two South Korean presidents changed within a few weeks of the two American presidents changing, and diametrically opposite conditions for each one of the presidents elected. So opposite parties in all four of those corners. We went without an ambassador for 17 months. And I was a senior U.S. official, not just U.S. military official, but the senior U.S. official in the Republic of Korea. Does that make me the ambassador? No, absolutely not. And being a military commander understood that doesn't make me the ambassador. It might be where people come to me on issues that should belong to an ambassador, but it doesn't make me the ambassador. It still makes me the senior military commander and the person they might turn to. And you work very closely then with the entire embassy team, the country team as we call it, at the embassy to try to work through that, to work through the answers to the questions and bring those capabilities together. But it's an integrative mindset that's required. That can also be at the policy level. But is that the role of the U.S. military at the policy level? And I would hope that the answer is no. But there have been many times where it has been, where we're trying to get our initial coordination in the war on terrorism, for example. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs realized that the machinery wasn't engaging. We were still operating with, if you will, our fingers apart instead of our fingers closed together to make a fist. Each agency, each department was operating a bit differently and not in an integrative way. So he created a chairman's working group on the war on terrorism. And it brought interagency partners to the Pentagon to have the discussion. Not to militarize the process, but to create an integrative approach. Over time, that yielded into the other things that it should be. The counterterrorism center, et cetera, all these things that were emergent from that. But initially, there has to be some kind of activating, integrative approach that happens somewhere. If it already exists in a given administration's approach, using the National Security Council and National Security Staff, for example, beautiful. That's rare. It usually is not there. And each department is, again, choosing their own direction. So how do you then bring that together? You have to have the mindset to do it, and then the structure to do that. Then the practice emerges from that, and then the proper policies emerge as a result of that. But it's at multiple levels that it applies.
Thank you, General Brooks. I know our
Could I add
excellent...
something?
Oh, certainly.
Yeah, jump on in.
If it's okay.
Sure.
I think Vince brought up a really, really important point. You know, if you heard what I just talked to you about, you know, non-kinetic elements of power, that people say, well, hey, that's not what the military is supposed to do. And I would agree with those people, but it's a false dichotomy. The issue that we had in Iraq in 2004 was that as part of the peace dividend, when the wall came down, we took USAID down from something in the vicinity of 17 to 20,000 folks down to a mere 5 to 6,000, and they were a contracting agency. And that created second and third order effects. You had not provided the military the tools that they needed to get out of that business. I had to get into that business because I couldn't get anybody to help me with that business. And I wanted to ensure that my soldiers were as protected as they possibly could be from making further terror. So be really careful when people offer the false dichotomy issue that says, well, that's not what the military is supposed to do. That's nation building. We're not going to get into that. The President of the United States had said, here's $20 billion. He told us we were going to get into that. How do we get into that if we don't have the tools to do that? And we had to learn.
Thank you, General Chiarelli. I know our excellent community gathered here, students, faculty might have a question or two. We are standing between this audience and lunch, so pop up, please.
Always a dangerous place to be.
Pop up. Oh, on the way. Then we'll go to Ambassador Litt.
I prefer to let the students ask the questions, but General Wolters, you have the ability to answer a question I really want to ask in front of this group. So we've heard several times today about the change that's happened in Europe, the real switch to recognizing a threat and getting serious about defense. And I just wanted to ask you about a period in late 21 to 22. I've gone to NATO, I've been on delegations, gone to NATO. I'm used to seeing how long it takes to get things done and how slow people move and how entrenched. And even if you convince the person at NATO, they got to go back and change the government, one of those 32 you're talking about. How much did the fact that the U.S. intelligence community was speaking with a very clear voice and we decided to go public and share a lot of that with our allies, how much did that accelerate their response, and how instrumental do you think that was in the way things have gone?
The impact was tremendous. The courage that the administration displayed to share that intel, as you know, could be very, very risky on the other end when you start to connect the dots on who is where doing what on planet Earth. But it was to me the single smartest move the United States of America could have made. It certainly kept us from getting close to World War III, and it was something that compelled at the time all 30 nations of NATO to agree finally, oh, Russia is actually invading and going to invade Ukraine. And for the audience, most of us in the military, or you well knew, we were pretty convinced starting in 2015 that this was an inevitability. We actually postured senior NATO commanders. My predecessor was a guy named Curtis Scaparrotti, who had been the USFK commander, and because of his diplomatic skills as a military leader, he was the right person to bring into NATO to start working this issue and integrating U.S. intelligence and sharing it with our NATO allies and partners was something that was imperative to convince them as to what is actually taking place on behalf of a very, very nefarious Russia. And if we hadn't done that, for all I know, the nations of NATO could still be arguing today about whether or not Russia has truly invaded Ukraine, and they did, and it was not an easy decision for the administration to make. It was extremely high on the risk spectrum with respect to loss of life forward, and all of the elbow grease that it took to prep the battle space in the environment to make sure that all of those wonderful intelligence folks were protected. That was accomplished in great fashion, which we don't talk about in public, but it was well done. But it was a tremendous decision, and I just applaud the president for making it at the time. And then the way it was executed after the fact was done very, very well. And at the end of the day, what needed to happen was to dissuade and deter Russia from ever touching 1 acre of NATO soil. And they never did. And Putin got exactly what he didn't want. As a result of that intelligence sharing decision, Sweden and Finland subsequently soon assessed into NATO, and Putin's problem became much larger than it was in the past with respect to how much he disliked NATO, and all that had to do with the courage that it took to make that decision. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Ambassador Litt, right up front.
We've talked a lot about conflict areas. One thing that concerns me a lot is the very understated and critical role of the United States military in responding to natural disasters around the world, whether catastrophic typhoons or earthquakes, in conjunction with USAID, with our partners, with the United Nations. Do you see any shrinking of that role in the future? And if not, how well are we going to be able to integrate with our non-military partners in responding to disasters?
I'll take a run at it. Thanks, Ambassador Litt. I see some reduction of it right now, and most of it's coming from disposition of forces if we're reducing capabilities in certain places. There are certain places where natural disasters happen over and over and over again. The Rim of the Pacific is one example of that, the classic Ring of Fire. And I think back to a circumstance in 2014 where a typhoon came through and hit the eastern edge of the Philippines near Tacloban, the Philippine Islands. And that created an opportunity. So there's a strange opportunity. First, you have the opportunity to help some other human beings who are in need because it destroyed everything in Tacloban. And oh, by the way, the first responders in those countries, some of them are buried underneath the rubble, and many of them have their families either displaced or homeless at the time. So they're not exactly able to immediately respond, even if you've helped to build their capability. Several countries began to respond in fairly short order, including the United States. China had been in friction with the Philippines and chose to punish them at that point in time. And they lost significant sway in the region as a result of that, throughout ASEAN especially, but because they chose not to and to use that moment as a chance to exact punishment for Philippines and its engagements with the United States. We should never be in that position that China had put itself in. I don't think China will be anymore either, by the way. They'll limit how they respond to something, but they won't fail to respond. Natural disasters are actually an opportunity to advance our interests while helping somebody through a problem. But only if you're a globalist. If you're not, then it's, hey, it's not my fault. It's not my problem. I didn't cause the hurricane. I didn't cause the tsunami. We should not think that way. We should recognize that we are in fact connected, and those same relationships I talked about earlier are often dependent upon it. Our relationship with Japan and with the Philippines, and the military relationships and economic and societal relationships that exist there are indeed connected, in fact, to disaster responses that occurred in both countries. And we should never miss that as an instrument of non-lethal U.S. power.
Thank you, General
Yeah,
Brooks.
and that goes back to what Secretary Gates said, and that's where I would disagree with Corey a little bit. Strategic communications is absolutely essential, and we have done as a nation a very poor job of explaining to the rest of the world some of the real great successes we have had in doing exactly what, because we don't speak with one voice, we don't take the time to let the rest of the world know, what some of the actions we've taken in these disasters have meant to these people. We've undersold ourselves because we don't have a common voice in many instances where we should.
And if I could, one more advantage of allies and partners, if you demonstrate a willingness to assist in these areas, they will do the same. And now you can bring more kit and more human capital to the equation with respect to providing a remedy.
The disaster response was actually the field where we did have direct communication with the People's Liberation Army, U.S. Army to People's Liberation Army, doing disaster management exercises and exchanges. We couldn't talk about joint operations, but we could talk about how to respond to disasters. And it was actually a place where we began to develop relationships. That's been turned off now.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Do I have a student by any chance, if you're a student? Sir?
Thank you. I have a question regarding, I know that a lot of you complain about issues with military-civilian cooperation, not having the civilian expertise to help in Iraq, for example, General Chiarelli, you mentioned. Where do we find the solutions to those problems? Do we reform within the DoD, or should we have cooperation between different departments in the government, say between state, transportation, etc., to help those civilian expertise, come into the military?
I could not hear
So
that.
how do we solve the challenge of not having that civilian expertise to deal with these emerging security challenges that have all these military, non-military tasks associated with them? If I phrased your question correctly, sir.
Yeah, I will never forget when I was Vice Chief of Staff, one of the things that Admiral Mike Mullen wanted to do when he was Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and again, this is where I disagree with Corey a little bit, was to find a way to move $200 million of DoD money over to state so that they could do some of the things that we were asking them to be able to do. And I knew that was pretty illegal, but he was looking for ways to do that. How can we help them out? I mean, it was amazing to me. I would go up and testify on different programs. I did it 42 times. It was 4 years as the vice. And, I would get some kind of criticism if I had a program that was $1 billion over what it was supposed to cost. Yet if you went to a state hearing, they were talking about $20,000 and $25,000. I mean, it was a totally different environment when you went to state. Here I was, having to worry about billions, and they were getting raked over the coals for a $25,000, whatever it might be. And that's just the way Congress was working. And I think we've got to understand that if you really want to get the military out of the kinds of things that I talked about, you've got to make sure that and you really want to bring our sons and daughters home and complete the mission, you need to make sure that some of these other instruments are available to use. I cannot imagine going into combat today, there's no USAID. And for me, that would be like saying to an armored guy, there's no tanks, okay? I'm not saying it was everything, but having that ability to be able to provide that. I will never forget, I was able to turn on clean potable water to 200,000 people in Solder City, in an area of Solder City. Did it on Valentine's Day, 2005. And in that area, Solder City, U.S. forces never had a problem again for the entire duration of the war in Iraq. It was my lasting legacy, was to turn on that water and save people for having to fight over that territory. I personally wish I had not had to do it. I wish there had been other people that could have done it for me, and they probably could have done it a hell of a lot better, faster, and cheaper than I did. But the fact of the matter is, it needed to be done. And I had not been provided the expertise, the kind of civilian expertise I needed to come on over there and do it.
Thank you. And with that, Generals, thank you for sharing your insights with us today.
Well done, sir, as always.
Great job.